All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rambleblog. Today we're going to be talking about a subject that I think is not really talked about a whole lot in terms of Kings of War articles and content, and that is seizing the initiative, or more accurately, dictating the flow of a game and how it's going to go from start to finish. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about planning a turn ahead or a couple turns ahead, but they don't really go into detail about what that actually looks like or how to do that. And more importantly, they don't really go over having a game plan from the get-go and then adjusting as you go with that plan. So we're going to talk about a number of those things. We're going to start with going as early as deployment. Technically, you could argue that the list building phase is the first phase of the plan, because how you build your list is going to determine what your game looks like. And I'm going to, as quickly as possible, show off two different armies that can do that. So with the first army we're working with, we're going to talk about deployment and how you can know what your opponent's going to deploy before you ever deploy a unit and before they ever deploy a unit, realistically. The goal here is to be able to out-deploy your opponent before they put a unit on the table. So the first thing that you have to do is, one, have a basic knowledge of all the scenarios and how they are played. We're going to focus on loot today specifically, loot with 3 tokens, 1 in the direct center, and then 2 offset 18 inches on either side. All the scenarios will play in similar ways, however, for the most part, with generally you wanting to pick the minimum +1. So in this situation, Kings is a game where most of the time, especially in GT settings, you're going to get a lot of scenarios that effectively you only have to win by 1 point. So like push, you're given 3 tokens to start, there's 1 token in the center. If you take the token in the center, you effectively win. With invade, you just need to get more units across the center than your opponent. In dominate, you just have to hold more units in the center than your opponent. In loot, you just need to take 1 more loot token than your opponent. In raise, you just need to raise 1 more than your opponent, and so on and so forth and so forth. Bluff is an exception to this rule because it's more difficult to determine where the tokens are going to be, and I might have an entire episode on Bluff because it is by far my favorite scenario in the entire game and one of the best ones that's been designed. But for now, the idea is that you need 2 of these loot tokens to win the game. So from the outset, that is the game plan, is get 2 loot tokens. We don't really care about the 3rd loot token. Our opponent can have that one, it doesn't matter, because as long as we have 2 and they have 1 at the end of the game, we win. It does not matter for you. So going into that, we need to, before we even put a unit on the table, we need to pick 2 loot tokens that we think are going to be best suited for us. Now, the only thing that has to go into place before this is determining which side of the table we're on. We're going to pretend that I got the bottom side of the table. So, with the bottom side of the table in mind, this giant building here is going to be a hang-up for me ever getting this token, so my game plan immediately becomes I need to get these 2 tokens. If I look at the top of the table, I can also use the top of the table for reference as to what my opponent's going to focus on, which is most likely, due to this building here, my opponent will probably focus on these 2 tokens, because they will be the easiest ones for him or her to pick up. In that situation, that means my game plan needs to be this one. I need to be able to take and hold this token. This token isn't a given by any chance. I still have to at least dedicate something to go pick it up and hold it. And I shouldn't leave this one just completely uncontested, but ultimately if I need to secure this one, that's fine, because something has to grab this, which means 1 unit of my opponent's must be dedicated to picking up this token at some point. That's 1 less unit for me to deal with, that's fine. But because of this, now that I know that my opponent's going to deploy to put these tokens, I can look at the opponent's list and say, okay, so what in the opponent's list is going to deploy where in order to secure these 2 tokens? In this example, I've thrown together just a string of halfling units. I don't even know if this is a full-on halfling list. I just put it together real quick just to show some examples of where you could expect things to be deployed. With a big building on one side of it, you're almost always going to see something anchored to that, especially when it's close enough to an objective that you could walk forward and then try to secure it. With a flying character, there are two schools of thought. In my second list, I'll show more of how I think about flying characters and how they should be played with, though I may save that for a second episode for flying characters specifically. But often you're going to either see them on the flanks or in the center of the opponent's list. There's this weird area that is approximately going from the flank to the center that you will almost never see a flying unit. And that's just because of how flyers work and what they have to do in order to make their points. So they will always be either on the far flanks or in the center, and if they're doing something here, then the center has been shifted, effectively, is what that actually indicates. Or the flank has been shifted and they're stacking closer to the inside of the board. So if we moved this whole thing here and put the flyer here, this is not as far out to the flank as you would expect, but this is now the flank, basically, and that's what that indicates. It would be more accurate to have all this stuff way over here somehow and the flyer right here, and then there's nothing over here, and that is the new flank. Obviously, players can break from this and will break from this, but these are going to be the more common ways you'll see people deploy, and so when you plan for it, you'll plan against that. In this case, the opponent has a bunch of cav. The cav don't have pathfinders, so they're going to go in the only area of the board where there isn't trees. You could deploy them over here, but at some point you got to put the infantry down and let the infantry get to work. And infantry tend to work better with a building anchoring their flank because they're slower and can take advantage of it for longer, whereas cavalry are going to get away from the building faster and therefore won't be able to take advantage of slowly maneuvering up with it. I don't even know if these guys have scout. I'm just going to pretend that they do, but assuming these two guys have scout, the first move from them is going to be to move toward the forest as quickly as possible. Of course, I've got my anchor turned off, but they're going to move toward the forest as quickly as possible because that allows them to get into cover and take shots early on. And then besides that, we've got a smattering of monsters scattered in between. This is to help get early flanks and to stack things. There are some additional tricks here, especially with Surge, and with certain monsters and units. You can do some silly shenanigans like deploy units like this sideways if they don't have a way to march anyway. So for instance, if I'm going to get stuck in this terrain and not be able to march through it, I might as well deploy sideways, because on my first turn I can then pivot and walk forward an extra inch. You can do this with any base that is longer than it is wide. These are small little things that you can anticipate, but most players are not going to do that because most players are going to focus on basically their two tokens, and then they're going to build battle groups around that. Sometimes you'll see slightly odd things like this with little gaps in between, and that's usually intentional to prevent a unit being charged early. More often than not, you see this happen as an army advances, not when it's first deployed. Most people deploy on the line when they're first going, because there's not really... There's one meme list that can charge you on the first turn. Most people aren't taking it right now. If anyone ever takes an army that can charge in the first turn again, which is theoretically fairly easy, you just get a bunch of surge stuff and rocket it across the board. But most people aren't going to do that these days, so it's usually safe to deploy as far up as possible, as this gives you the maximum amount of board control, which we'll talk about here in a second. So, looking here, this is, again, a general idea without even looking at the opponent's list or what's actually in it, but just having an understanding of what the basic units do. This is how I envision they would deploy. Now, this may be off by a bit, but as long as you have a general idea of, okay, they may drop here, I don't even have to worry about them putting their units down, because I know where they're going to end up going anyway. A lot of times this will come with some what is known as game sense a lot of the time, where effectively just over time as you have played various lists, you'll see people deploy them in the same fashion, and you'll kind of get a feeling for how people deploy certain units or where people deploy certain units, and that will make this knowledge a lot easier to come by The first couple times you try it, you're probably going to guess some things wrong. And I still guess plenty of things wrong. And obviously people don't fit in boxes. So the idea that a one-size-fits-all strategy would somehow always work just is not the case. Some people are going to do odd things like throw their cab in the center of the board, or take an all-fast list in the first place so that it doesn't have specific battle groups or specific units. People talk about battle groups as if they're required to build a list, but the truth is you could just take all of an entire army of zombies, which someone did at the Best of the Rest last year. And if you just flood the board with bodies, how do you deploy against that? Well, it turns out you just kind of have to play with it and figure it out when that happens. But these are the exceptions to the rule often, not the base most of the time. These are the skew lists, not the standard. So we're not going to worry about them too much. So on my side, I also need to know how I'm going to deploy my army before I even deploy it. And realistically, and this is something I see a lot of new people do, which I would personally say is not the correct way to respond to deployment, is new players will see a unit go out like this and say, oh no, there's a flying monster here, and their immediate thought is, how do I respond to this monster? And that is not how to play the game. The correct answer should be, I don't care that this monster is going to go here. First off, you should have known, based on the previous entire conversation that we just had, that this monster was going to go here before we even started putting troops down. So it doesn't matter. In fact, this doesn't even have to go here. This could be held back until the very last drop, but we know that that monster is probably going to go right here, or it's going to go right here. So it doesn't really matter. We just need to know how to deal with it when it gets to us. Until then, we can deploy however we want. So, if anything, you can actually use this against a lot of opponents who will fall into that trap where you can drop a monster down and watch them crazily overreact and deploy a whole bunch of things to try and counter it, rather than just deploy a smarter, better, and stronger deployed formation. So, in this case, if I look at my units, again, remembering my objective is to take these 2 tokens. How do I deploy these units so that I can have a good start to the game no matter where my opponent drops? Well, first things first, this battle group of dwarven shooting things needs to have some degree of line of sight, and it needs to stay together. These things are both true and cannot be changed. So, this battle group needs to go somewhere like right here. This is totally fine to have this in terrain because we're probably not moving these long shots for the entire game. We're probably going to be taking shots through this gap in the hill and the forest, if not at things on the forest or on the hill, and that's going to be the entire game for us. Realistically, we might move these 2 units forward to try and pick up these loot tokens if they're dropped behind, but otherwise these units are just not moving the entire game. Realistically, if I wanted to be a little bit more correct with this deployment, the correct way to drop this group should be here. And the reason for that is that this unit is already touching the forest, so it should be able to see through and get pot shots at things. So these units are in the terrain, which we don't care about outside of just walking forward, because we're always going to want to take at least pot shots. And again, we're still giving ourselves as much of a clear line of sight and at least uncovered shots once things start touching the hill, or covered shots if they're not on the hill. So this gives us a decent amount of movement. This also gives us more room for us to stack against this building here, which we absolutely want to do. So we absolutely want to have a stacked flank here against this building. At this point, these Soul Reavers, no matter how I play them, are going to want some form of incoming coverage, so to prevent being shot off the table. So we're going to put, no matter what, we're going to have these trolls here somewhere. Now, as we discussed in the first episode where we talked about base sizes and movement size, we want to make sure that the gap in between the Soul Reavers is smaller than the base of this flyer, because no matter where that flyer goes, we should just have a deployment that basically says the flyer will never touch these Soul Reavers, ever. And then we don't have to worry about where the flyer is, basically. Or at least not in the terms of the Soul Reavers. We can worry about the trolls getting hit, but that's the point of the trolls, is to get hit. And then, since we're going to use this building very heavily to stack the flank, probably going to have one of our hordes of whites here, and then the other horde of white here, probably with the 2 Wraith troops to back them up. So the Wraiths are fast enough to where they can maneuver back toward the center of the board if necessary. And the whites, this white, I didn't write it on it, would have +1 speed, which would make it our fastest unit to keep on the flank. And then we would spread our inspiring to match, which is why no matter what type of battle groups, characters are always going to go to where they can try to inspire things for the most part. And casters, you really don't care where casters go for the most part. Again, assuming that people are taking them, as we discussed in the last episode, as magic item buffs, they're going to go to whichever units need the most support. So if you put down defense 6 stuff, that Bane Chant caster is going to go as close to your defense 6 stuff as it can. You can't really worry about that in deployment. It's not worth it. It's just going to be there. And by the time that a defense 6 army fights a non-defense 6 army that has Bane Chant support, those units are going to be in combat anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Alrighty, and then Jarvis would go here. This gives me maximum surge coverage, which is really important for undead. It gives me the maximum amount of ranged arc that I'm going to get from my side of the board, which is pretty limited on this table, but I'll do it if I can. And it puts 2 of these tokens securely within my reach. Now, we've basically abandoned this token entirely, but again, that's fine, because that means that these 3 units over here are going to have to waste time coming around the edge of the board before they ever get to the center of the table. And by that time, depending on how the game is going, all this could be dead. And this goes into what one of our next topics is, which is force concentration. And again, this kind of revolves around having that outset from the very beginning of the game, which is, from the start, our game plan is take these 2 tokens. Here. We're going to take these. That means that if we ignore this one, if we assume that we're just not going to get this one, we can put more of my army here, to where now I can hit less of the opponent's army. If I am fighting 2/3 of my opponent's army with the entirety of my army, more than likely the math says I should win. Obviously, there's going to be tricks around that, and there are ways that you can stem that off as the person who's playing defense there, but more often than not, you do not want to have your forces split. It's actually really bad to split your army up into smaller groups. They just can't support each other fast enough. Even if you've got a really, really fast army, you end up having units that waste entire turns just getting back into the fight instead of being in the fight. The game is only 6 moves. You get 6 moves for every unit, 6 activations. If you're wasting one of those activations just moving, and it's not the first or second turn, that's usually not good. This doesn't apply to every unit. There are going to be some units that spend a lot more time moving before they actually attack, like flyers. There are going to be some armies that spend a lot more time moving. There are going to be some units that are only going to move and probably never actually fight. That's okay. But generally speaking, you want to be engaged, throwing dice at things by turn 3 minimum. Even if you're a grindy army, even if you're a shooty army. Well, shooting armies are probably going to be starting to throw dice on turn 2 or turn 1. But realistically, you want to get your stuff involved, get your stuff taking actions early. Once you're in the scrum, dice are going to start rolling, things are going to start disappearing. So from the outset, our game plan is take these 2 tokens. From the outset, we're going to engage less of the opponent's army with more of our army. We've already set up a plan from the start. We're going to move forward, we're going to shoot and pick up elements. We've kind of identified where units are going to go. Because of that, now we can know, okay, I need to tilt this flank here so I can cover for when those knights come in, but otherwise I can effectively steal the center token and back up with it quickly, and therefore win the game. I have planned that now, this is the plan. Obviously, the plan never, as the famous Moltke once said, the plan never survives contact with the enemy. But my game plan should be to win the game on turn 4. I should be able to determine whether or not I have won the game on turn 4. And that may sound presumptuous, to say the least, but even if it doesn't go according to plan, you should still aim for it. You should still aim to have won the game on turn 4. Now, most games still play until turn 6 no matter what. You don't say, I'm not going to delete my opponent's army on turn 4. That's not going to happen. I just don't have enough stuff to do that. But I can know if I've won by turn 4. And the way I know that is by if I've taken the center token, which is my win condition. This is the condition that I win, is taking the center token and the rightmost token. If I have both of those on turn 4, and I have made it so my opponent cannot get them back from me, then the game is effectively over, and now I am just playing cleanup. So from this point, I need to figure out every way to get those 2 tokens, keep them, move them back. So my first turn is probably going to be just a general advance across the board. If my opponent doesn't advance, if I get the first turn, I may even be as risky as to move the Soul Reavers all the way forward as a full 12-inch move. More accurately, I probably move the Trolls forward and then surge them to try and get to the center token as quickly as possible. If the opponent gets first turn, I don't have enough speed in this list to prevent them coming forward. This is why it's always good to have at least some degree of speed, because it forces your opponent to take that into consideration when you move forward. Now, sometimes you gotta let your opponent get a charge in. Sometimes your objective is going to require that. Always remember the ultimate goal of the game, in this case, holding these 2 tokens. I think a lot of people will get lost or confused or miss opportunities when they're playing a game because they focus. They'll either get lost in the I need to kill stuff first, or I need to prevent my opponent from doing this part of the objective. I see this a lot in Push, where I'll see people try to stop the opponent from getting their 3 tokens across, when realistically what they should be focusing on is getting their 3 tokens and then securing the center token. If you can do that, if you can achieve your win condition, then it doesn't matter what your opponent is doing because you've won. Obviously, to a degree, you need to, you can't just ignore the opponent, but you can ignore the parts that don't threaten you. You have to always keep in mind what their win condition is going to be, what they're trying to achieve, and what their options are so that you can plan for that. So always have the general game plan. I know from looking at my opponent's army that he's not going to be able to march here, so he can only walk up 5. And because of that, that's going to stagnate most of his line. It's unlikely that he will move all of these as fast as possible. And the reason for that is that it opens up a lot of units to either shoot those units or to charge them with multi-charges. And especially when it comes to units that are large, wide hordes like this, this is exceptionally dangerous because these units will not contribute to any sort of countercharge action that happens because these guys get charged here. Assuming this was large cav or something. So you always have to be a little bit cautious about that. You don't want to move too far forward too aggressively and get caught out. So realistically, these lines are probably going to stagnate. And then there would be a forward movement, keeping the flank anchored. In this case, we would hold these back because we can use the hill for line of sight to block things off. So we're playing with the theoretical, moving a little bit too far forward there. We're playing with the idea that this hill is effectively, due to its line of sight blocking nature, going to give us an advantage in terms of terrain and how we work around it. So this one's definitely getting a little bit more rambly than I want it to, but that is why we are calling them Ramblebloggs. So if you're on the opposite side of this, it should be very rare, and this comes with a lot of practice in analyzing the state of a game. But realistically, there is no it's kind of even in Kings. I think you might hear people who are live casting games say that it looks kind of even, and a lot of times the reason they're actually doing that is to be polite. It's to not make it sound like there. How do I phrase this? Typically, the initiative can switch from one player to the next literally in the span of one turn. So it's very hard to say that people are even, because realistically what that means is that one is ahead and that the casters just don't know which. That's a more accurate statement than saying they're being polite, because the truth is that usually the casters themselves don't know who is actively in the lead. And that's because both players should be, in a good Kings of War game, playing for their win condition, which usually looks different from the opponent's win condition. Because of that, it can be difficult to tell when one person is winning. Dominate is usually one of the ones that's hardest to call until the very end, because the win condition usually is dive into the center, and sometimes Dominate will be won on the last turn. Invade, a lot of the times, can be won on the last turn. Which begs the question, what did I mean by win by turn 4 for scenarios that you can effectively only actually win on the last turn? And the answer is you should know that you're going to win by turn 6 on turn 4. With Invade, if you have removed enough of your opponent's unit strength that can cross the board and have guaranteed that enough of yours will get across the board, the game is effectively over. You are just wrapping up the turns. In chess, this would be the equivalent of if you have removed all the pieces except your opponent's king, and you are slowly but surely walking it across the board with a king, with a queen and a rook, the game is over. We just don't. It's just going to take another 8 turns until the game is over. So you get things like checkmate in 5, and that's effectively what we're referencing here. Is this is the we know that checkmate is coming. How do we get to that point? It is rare, but not impossible, to basically come back from being in the checkmate spot in Kings, which is one of the unique aspects of this game that makes it so fun and so cool, is that you do not get stuck in a guaranteed loss a lot of the times. You can plan around that. You can plan to be ahead and winning and basically push forward after turn 4 to keep winning. But if you're on the losing side, if you have lost the game plan, if your objective is no longer achievable, first off, there's always going to be ways to try and recover. Because Kings is a dice game, what you often see is players will discuss games, or good players will discuss games, and they'll talk about, first thing, that my original plan didn't go as planned. And then my backup plan didn't go as planned too. And then I was just playing recovery. I had recognized the game was over and I was trying to conserve points. And usually that's what good players will describe a game like. In situations where they lost due to an element of their plan not going correctly. So in this case, if, let's say, my plan is that this horde needs to break fast, because I need to keep these units from getting over here and engaged before I can take these tokens and get away. This is a very quick and loose reconstruction of what would happen, but let's assume that, like, we pitter-patter one of these hordes down to a meaningful level, and then we manage to get in a nice surge flank. So let's say something like this happens. Let's say I don't break either of these units. That would be really bad for win condition. That would be really bad for winning this game at this point, because in theory, we've put enough effort into both these units. We need one of them to break in order to maintain the momentum, to keep the initiative, to keep moving forward. We would have effectively have lost the initiative. My opponent now has the chance to make a play to seize the initiative. My opponent would realistically probably find a way to get in the flank here. Obviously, this tank would have been further forward in order to pull this. But something around these lines and these lines in order to facilitate things. Now, let's say both of these units get picked up. The game is not over. There are still ways to recover from this. In this case, we're assuming that these units are still very light, so we move in the second wave. All the time, this is getting closer, and my win condition, which is effectively don't let these get into combat before it's too late, is definitely still achievable, but now it's getting very less likely that that will happen. So at this point, we're sacking a piece to hold them up, and then we're moving the more valuable pieces into this combat here. So probably somewhere around this. I'm being very loose with my angles here, do not judge me. This is just a fake proxy assumption of how this game would play out. So things maneuver, this guy gets a flank, and these guys are dead. So in this situation, we managed to now throw enough pieces back in that maybe if we pick up these two, we should be able to achieve our original win condition, which was getting this token and getting out. And my opponent theoretically has still not gotten enough force compression here to recover from the fact that he had too much stuff over here. If I were to snakes both these units at this point, the game is effectively over, because on my following turn, I will then lose all my remaining activation pieces. Maybe not all of them, but enough of my pieces to where I no longer have enough left on the table to make a reasonable play. This is called activation, or what I would call activation lock, where what you tend to see in chess is that initially losing a single piece is not a devastating end to the game. But if you lose enough pieces to where you can no longer overcome the deficit, the game is just a slow downhill struggle from there. And at that point, what you're trying to do is either kill enough stuff to make up points in attrition-based events, or find any way possible to deny your opponent their win condition. In this case, I might try to shoot these hordes off the table. I might try to shoot the knight unit off the table that's carrying the loot tokens. If I can get them all to drop and not get picked up, I might be able to play for a draw. Realistically, this game is a loss at this point. I would then try to conserve as many points as possible. And recognizing when that happens is a really important part of the game. Like, there's no shame in taking a loss if the plan doesn't work out the way it's supposed to. But recognizing that and immediately moving on to, okay, so how do I conserve my points in the event, is really important. Don't keep throwing stuff at the brick wall that didn't work. It doesn't make it any better after the first two attempts. Because again, we've now spent 2 turns trying to get the win condition, they both failed. And that's what makes Kings a great game and not a guaranteed game. At the end of the day, you make the best play you can with the best pieces you've designed, and that's what gives you a win. So realistically, this could have just as easily been, these dropped on turn 3, and now I have these 2 tokens, and then the rest of the game becomes my opponent's desperate struggle to push through here. And if my opponent were in this position, I would call this his first turn of error, would be these units attempting to push through here, and if he did so quickly enough, the game might still be up in the air. But if he stalls out here for 1 turn, now at this point these tokens are far enough in my backfield that I have them safely secured, and the game is over. So this works on both factors. The important thing to remember is that you should be prepared for that win condition the entire game. So as soon as the game starts, the plan needs to be push for that. Don't waste turns doing things that don't help you. Don't waste charges doing things that don't get you these objectives. Focus on the game plan, focus on keeping the initiative with you, focus on driving that, and don't try to react to your opponent as often as you can. Focus on your game plan and making your opponent react to that instead. And that'll end up winning you games. So we'll talk more about threat and threat projection and how to use that to help dictate some of these movements to help force your opponent to not be able to complete their win condition, and giving you better maneuvering with your win condition. We'll talk about that when we do dragons, chariots, and other nimble characters at the same time. So that'll be the next episode. So until next time, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe if you like the content. If you have any ideas for a topic you'd like me to try covering, I'm absolutely down for those. Just leave a comment either on Fanatics or on the YouTubes. But other than that, y'all have a wonderful rest of y'all day, and I'll see y'all next time.